Welcome to Office Hours. I'm Steve Drost. With me, as always, Will Kaplan. Of course, me and Will both from the Quivr team. And what is Quivr? We are the first CRM built by financial advisors for financial advisors, where our objective is simple. How can we help you run your business at peak efficiency? And each episode, we tackle a couple of cool items that came directly from our users who are trying to do just that, make their life a little bit easier. Will, I missed office hours. I know we tell our users that we're both going to be at office hours, but it happens. I missed office hours. It was either last week or the week before. And you said you guys had a good conversation about naming convention. What was that?
Yeah. So one of the questions that came up was I'm a newer user. I've been on the platform, for a couple of weeks now. And as I'm going through all this data, how should I be naming it? We brought data over for this firm, but they were starting to realize like maybe the convention that they'd been using for a long time wasn't optimal. We were sort of, the couple different people were talking and it just all of a sudden it came up. And the one that the one that jumped out at me immediately was it's not necessarily intuitive. Like we name things initially, I think, based on how we think about them. But the problem is that you also have to kind of think longer term about how am I going to use this data? How am I going to interact with this data? What might be, what are some of the like bends in the road that we don't see yet that we might have to be mindful of as we're coming up on them? And so like the one that, I think is near and dear to Quiver hearts is what if you've got like two brothers and they're both named Drost, and what are you going to do? Like, how is your system going to be able to accommodate that? So even if it's like household level, contact level, other records in the system, like what's going to happen as you start naming these things, and is that convention going to work for you long term? And it occurred to me that like we don't really cover this anywhere in terms of why you might interact with data one way or why you might interact with data another way. But like it's actually a pretty good topic. I know that when I was, again, like when I was practicing, I had a naming convention that I really liked. I used it for kind of everything. I'm sure you have strong opinions on this as well. And so like I thought maybe we could share a little bit about like the ways that we did it and what we liked about it, what we didn't like about it, as a way to kind of give some people at least some information to think about as they are naming records in their own systems.
No way. Me, a strong opinion? No way. Yeah, it's a great concept, and it's when I'm naming something inside of Quiver, the root of the naming convention, to be honest, comes from where am I going to use this in the future? So you use the example of brothers, right? Well, let's say Ryan. Most people listening to this know Ryan is my brother, the lead dev of Quiver. He also is in my Drost Financial Quiver, right? And if I were to call my family the Drost family, and then his family the Drost family, how am I going to know what that is? And that's again, how am I going to use this data in the future? So naming households in my environment, Drost family, every single time I want to find me or I want to find Ryan, it's going to be a pain in the butt. And that thought process can be applied to everything, like you mentioned. And that's why we give you 3 different names for a household in the system, right? Household name, which I recommend last name, comma, first and first. So my wife's name is Marissa. So Drost, comma, even, sign, Marissa, right? And apply that to everybody. The likelihood that you're going to have a duplicate entry there is slim to none. Now, of course, somebody listening to this will have a duplicate. And then we give you the informal names, and we give you the envelope name, right? To then go off of that and use those for other things. And you're talking about, how am I going to use this data in the future in other areas of the system? RMDs is a perfect example of that. Let's say I'm 75 and I'm taking an RMD, and you want to name an RMD Steve's RMD. Steve is like the most common name in the world. How are you going to know that's my RMD? So with that, I would name that RMD the 4-digit year, not the 2-digit year, by the way, the 4-digit year. Because if I did a 2-digit year, when the decade turns over and I hit sort by date or sort by name, it's not going to work. So I do the 4-digit year and then probably a dash, and I would do Drost, comma, Steve, RMD. That way, if I want to find my RMD, I would look for, I'd type search, or I would type something and I would find it right there. And there's not going to be any duplicates because it's Steve Drost's 2025 RMD. So anytime you're doing something with a naming convention, or how do I name this? I would think to future you. How am I going to want to find this data in the future? What am I going to use this data for in the future? Maybe somebody's taking those RMDs and they're using like an Opero or a cloud files, and they're making documents out of it. Well, maybe you want to have that name show up on a deliverable or a one-page value add for that client. Well, if that's the case, you probably don't want to do my naming convention because that doesn't look very pretty. So maybe I would call it instead Steve Drost's 2025 RMD. Because I want that name to hit up on hit up on that deliverable. Does that make sense, Will?
Does. And I think this is one of the challenges. And you actually even alluded to something else really. I don't even know if you noticed when you were doing it, but when you were talking about naming your household, you used your formal name.
Yes.
You have one of these names where you go by Steve, but your name is actually Steven. And so that's another one of these things where when you're naming contacts, do you name it the name that everybody goes by? Do you name it the name that you're going to want to merge into like a Schwab document or a form or something like that where you're filling paperwork out? Like it's these little gotchas that you kind of have to be mindful of as you're naming all of these things. And to your point, like with the RMD, I always put the year in it as well, because when I'm sorting them, I want to be able to know, okay, this was this year's, this is last year's, this is the year before. I want to be able to, sort in that order. And then I got to QCDs and I was like, oh, now I have a problem because I want the year and I want probably the name of the charity and I want probably the amount in there. But some of these people, they give like to the same charity and the same amount in the same year. And so now I've got all these records that like they're different. Salesforce understands they're different because Salesforce uses kind of like a hidden field as a name for records that we don't typically interact with. But at the same time, like as I'm looking at my list, I've got a whole bunch of like, you know, 2025, the human fund, $50. And then I did it again next month. And I did it a month after that. And you get to this point where it's like, oh, well, now I feel like this may not be working anymore. Because what if I have to go hunt down a single one? Yeah, there's a created date and there's stuff like that in the system to help me. But at the same time, like I wanted something that was easy. And so it's one of these just challenging things where initially you're like, oh yeah, this is easy, no big deal. And then as you start to interact with it, you're like, yeah, this is a little bit harder than I thought it was.
Yeah, and I think the root takeaway here is this is one of those instances where we can't just tell you what to do because everybody's going to use that data in a different fashion for a different purpose. And when we run into that, right, we talk about with Quivr, especially with newer users, our objective is to get you maybe 80% of the way to where you're trying to go. Naming convention and how you're going to interact with this data, that's red zone stuff. That's the last 20 yards. That's stuff that we can't necessarily do for you. So you're going to have to, we use the whiteboard example, whiteboard. How am I going to interact with this information in the future? And I think that's going to be your answer to what you want, with the two big things being how easily can you find it? And that's the naming convention that provides you that unique identifier, excluding your QCD example, right? How do I find Steve Drost's 2025 RMD? Then the second is, who is this information going to be in front of? If it's just going to be internal, then I like the 4-digit year, the person's name, and then whatever it is. But if this is going to be something that you're going to want to present back to people, right, in that Apero, in that cloud files, that deliverable, something like that, then you might need to sacrifice a little bit of the internal searchability to then allow you to just have that data appear how you want your end client to have it appear. But no, this is a great question. Another awesome reason that I like being built on Salesforce, right? Because the end user ultimately has the ability to tweak this information, not only just the raw data, but tweak how that data is presented to them to match their business use. But that's a wrap, Will. Good stuff as always. If you are a Quivr user, remember, join us on Wednesdays for office hours where we can help you with similar items. If you're not a Quivr user, that's okay. Everybody makes mistakes. Nobody is perfect. But remember, it's not too late. Come schedule a demo. Come hang out with me. Come hang out with Will and see what Quivr can do live for you.